to live in a dictatorial regime where you don't know whether you're going to get food to eat tomorrow. And if you go back to the Soviet Union prior to its collapse and you look at the rationing process that existed there, it wasn't prices, but it was long lines, and many people who went through the process of waiting in those long lines would get inside the grocery store and find nothing on the shelves, right? So these kind of shortages that emerge and ceilings that are imposed on different goods are sometimes motivated. We're talking about governments here imposing price ceilings, but in many cases they impose those price ceilings for political survival because they don't want to be faced with uprisings because people are rioting about the cost of one of the basic necessities of life, namely the food that's available to them. All right? Okay, evaluating price controls. As we noted in our first lecture, one of the principles, the 7 major principles related to microeconomics, that markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. But quite often, the government or the public sector, regardless of whether it's a democracy, a totalitarian regime, a dictatorial regime, they may find that those prices, which are, in the context of Adam Smith, the invisible hand for guiding the allocation of societal resources, they sometimes find that unacceptable. And they intervene. And one of the unintended consequences of the 2 examples that we just looked at, namely minimum wages for unskilled labor or rent controls, that often those price controls turn out to hurt rather than help low-income groups. That's an unintended consequence. Not in all cases, but in many situations. Okay, so now we're going to turn to taxes. And as I noted at the outset, all governments, whether it's a local government, a state government, a federal government, is engaged in imposing taxes. Okay? Sales taxes. There's also VAT taxes in many parts of the world where governments take the value. It's called a value-added tax. And a tax is imposed on the incremental value with regard to changing the form and purpose or functionality of a particular good. We're going to be looking at very specific kinds of taxes. And these taxes are presumed to raise revenues for national defense, for public schools, for recycling, whatever. And the government has the authority to make buyers and sellers pay this particular tax. There are 2 basic types of taxes that are out there in all market situations. One is referred to as a specific tax, which is a tax on the unit sold. Another is a tax based on the price of the good. We'll be looking at per unit taxes only because in terms of the insights, it doesn't make any difference. It's a little more complicated to look at taxes that are percentage of prices or ad valorem taxes. That's how they're defined when they're a percentage of the value or the price of the good. And it's only more complicated in the sense of how the demand curves shift or the supply curves shift. Right? But the fundamental insights are the same. Okay, so we'll be looking only at per unit taxes, and your book does the same. Let's take a simple example, the market for pizza. And without any governmental intervention, let's suppose that without the tax, the equilibrium price is 10 per pizza, and the number of pizzas moving through this market is 500. Okay? Now, let's suppose that the government comes along and imposes a tax of $1.50 per pizza on buyers. Not on sellers, but on buyers. Okay, so that's our event, right? We have our original equilibrium, which is the $10 and the 500 units of quantity. That's our equilibrium quantity. And now we're coming along and saying, okay, there's an event. And the event is the government is now going to demand from all buyers to pay $1.50 tax for each and every pizza that they purchase. And once again, we go through those same 3 steps. Does this shift supply? Does it shift demand? And if so, in what direction? Right? Okay, what's the answer? Does it shift supply? No. Does it shift demand? In which direction? Yes, exactly. Okay. So the buyer would end up, to buy the same quantity before, all the buyers, to buy this quantity, 500 units, they would have to end up facing a price of $8.50, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't buy the 500 units. So as someone just suggested, that demand has to shift to the left. Hence, the tax on buyers shifts the demand curve down by the amount of the tax. Okay? So that's why it's so straightforward to do the analysis with a per unit tax, right? Because it shifts it in a parallel way. Suppose it was an ad valorem tax. Would it shift it in a parallel way? What would happen?
Is the tax bigger the bigger quantity?
The bigger the quantity? There we go. The bigger the price. Because it's a percentage. It's going to be a percentage of value, so it's the bigger the price. All right. So the new equilibrium quantity would be different than it was before, not the 500, but the 450. And the new equilibrium price would be $9.50, not $10. Now, here is the important step in the analysis with regard to incidence. So the new equilibrium is $9.50. There is a tax of $1.50. What is the burden of that $1.50 on buyers versus sellers? Now, we started this process with the $1.50 being imposed on buyers. But is that the actual burden of the tax? Does the entire $1.50 reside with buyers of pieces? And the reason it doesn't is why? Pardon? Speak up. Right. At that particular new equilibrium quantity, coming from the $9.50 is going to be $4.50. And the buyers are actually paying $11, right? But the sellers are only receiving $9.50. And by the way, that's why I've introduced the notation now, because of the governmental involvement of imposing taxes, there's a wedge between the price that the buyer is paying and the price that the seller is receiving. That wasn't the case before government imposing a tax. Each of the 2 prices were the same. What the price that the buyer was paying is the same as the price the seller was receiving. But now, because of that tax, the buyer ends up paying this $11, and as I indicated, the seller only received $9.50. And the difference between those 2 prices is that per unit tax of $1.50. But now, with regard to the burden, as in our 3-step process with regard to economic analysis of supply and demand, we have to compare the old equilibrium before the imposition of the tax which is this point, versus the new equilibrium, which is this point, and ask ourselves the question, what is the incidence of the tax? That is to say, what portion of the 150 is borne by the seller, and what portion is borne by the buyer? Okay? It's shared among buyers and sellers. Buyers and sellers are the market participants. In this particular example, the buyers pay $1 more after the tax than they paid before the tax. Before the tax, they pay 10. After the tax, they're paying 11. So their burden is $1, but the total tax is $1.50. So quite obviously, there are only two parties in this marketplace. They're sellers and they're buyers. So if we want to look at what the burden is on the sellers, they, before the imposition of the tax, they were receiving $10. Now they're only receiving $9.50. Hence, their burden is 50 cents. So, now, okay, sorry. So with regard to this first example, we have a total tax of $1.50, but the buyers end up with a burden of only $1 of that $1.50, and the sellers end up with a burden of 1/3 of the $1.50, namely 50 cents. Okay? Yes? Yes, they're going to lose. Yes, yes, certainly. But now we're only looking at who has the burden for the tax. We're not going the next step and saying what's happening to their profitability. We're certainly, with this, remember this supply function tells us their willingness to offer pizza to the marketplace for different prices. So as we'll see later, what lies behind the supply function is their cost of providing those pizzas to the marketplace. Right? Okay, now let's suppose that instead we decided to impose the tax on sellers, not the buyers. Okay? So what happens through our three-step process? Does the demand shift? No. Does the supply shift? I'm sorry? To the left. Yes, indeed. Okay, so now at the 500 units, since the seller is only going to see $10, if they're going to offer 500 units to the marketplace, and if they're going to pay the 150, they got to get 1150 for that same quantity, right? Right? So it shifts to the left, as pointed out, and we can go through the same process of analyzing what is the incidence or burden associated with the imposition of that tax. Okay? The new equilibrium quantity is going to be here, not here. So once again, we're going to be comparing this new equilibrium to the old equilibrium. And the quantity at that new equilibrium is going to be 450. And the buyer price, what the buyer is going to end up paying, is going to be $11. The seller only received $9.50 in net because they have to turn over $1.50 per unit to the government. Notice in all of these graphs, they're two-dimensional graphs, so we're looking at just buyers and sellers, but there's a third party that isn't represented in the graph, right? Who's the third party? The government, picking up that $1.50 per unit for each unit that moves through the market. Okay? So the seller receives $9.50. The difference between the two, as it was when we imposed the tax on buyers, is $1.50. Let's look at the incidence as we did in the case of buyers, and it'll turn out that the sharing of the 150 is exactly the same as it was when we imposed the tax on buyers, not on sellers. So the tax drives a wedge between the price that buyers pay and the price that sellers receive, but the burden of that tax sharing is going to be the same regardless of whether the tax is imposed on buyers or on sellers. Let's look at, again, our hotel rooms, and let's suppose the government imposes a tax on buyers of $30 per room. Yes?
Will the buyers always receive more of the burden?
No. Okay. We'll see in a moment. No way. No way. It's going to depend. What's it going to depend on? Thank you. We'll see. Because that's why we spend so much time on elasticities, right? Because it's going to turn on elasticities. And to think about it, by the way, let me jump out in front for a moment so you can spend some time developing your intuition. One of the reasons it depends critically on elasticities, because if I'm very sensitive to a price change, I can avoid the burden of the tax by leaving that market, for example. Right? All right. So coming back to this example, go ahead, give it some thought, talk to your neighbors, let's see where it goes. There's a tax on buyers of $30 per room. What's going to be the burden, and what is going to be the new equilibrium?
Why is the price that buyers pay not $11.50? Like when you showed it would raise $1.50 to $11.50, and they're paying $11.
But if they pay 11, but the seller's only getting $9.50.
But why can't they pay $11.50?
Because that wouldn't be the new outcome with the imposition of a $1.50 tax. Go back and look at the chart. If you look at the chart,
Trying to show that it would go $1 to buyers.
it's $1.50, and it turns out the seller is going to receive $9.50, and they're going to receive $9.50 after paying the $1.50 tax, which means that the buyers must be paying $11, not $11.50.
Oh, was that a step down though?
Yes.
Oh, so
Yeah.
like, if you get set at $9.50.
Yeah. Then you have to pay. If you set it at 10, you'd have to pay $11.50, right?
But then the buyers would get $1.50. The buyers don't lose nothing if you
No, whatever the tax is going to determine what the buyers in equilibrium, what the buyers pay versus what the sellers pay. The difference between those two prices is going to be the tax, always.
is that
Okay, what's the answer? Is there an answer? Go ahead. $20. Where'd you get the $20? No, I thought the tax was $30. Are you talking about you've gone all the way to the sharing and what the sharing is? Go ahead.
And then the buyer would be paying $10 for tax.
Their burden with regard to the tax will be $10. Now, note up to this point in time, we developed the standard analysis looking at shifts in demand and supply curves, right? But once you know what the wedge is, you don't have to go through that complicated analysis of looking at the shifts. For example, if you know here, you know that the tax that has to be paid is $30. I know what the original equilibrium is. It's right here. I know that the buyer, B subscript B, is going to have to include the $30 of taxes. And I just come along here and look at the wedge. That is the tax right here. Okay? Right? And now, if I'm only concerned about what the burden is or what the incidence is among these two parties, I come to what was my equilibrium prior to imposing the tax. That was $100. And the number of rooms available was 100. And as you suggested, after the tax is being imposed, the new quantity is 80. The price that is being received by hotel proprietors is going to be $80. The price that is being paid by those who are renting those hotel rooms is 110, and thus I end up with a payment, a total payment of $30 per unit, but the sharing of that burden is $10 for buyers and $20 for sellers, which is exactly what you said, right? Okay, what I've done is short-circuited looking at the demand and supply because this is a simple per unit tax, so all I have to do is find the wedge, right? But you can do it through shifting the demand and supply as well. Okay, so that is the solution to that problem. Now, turning to a point we made a moment ago, what does it really depend on with regard to the burden, the incidence? It turns on elasticities. Why does it turn on elasticities? It turns intuitively on elasticities because the sensitivity of buyers or sellers determine how much of the burden they're going to get with regard to any tax. Right? You can stop and think about it for a moment. Suppose the supply was perfectly elastic. Right? Would the sellers have any burden at all? Would they? Go ahead.
no, they wouldn't because the demand would remain the same if they needed like 2 times this.
Yeah.
So they just keep raising this.
The sellers are just super sensitive, right? And as a result of that super sensitivity, they're going to avoid, I think your book talks about, they will leave the market if there's a tax being imposed. But they don't have to leave the market. All they have to do is be super sensitive. And suppose demand is perfectly inelastic. Who's going to end up with all the burden? Pardon? What'd you say? Sellers? If demand is perfectly inelastic, sellers would end up with all the burden? Pardon? What? Buyer. Well, you changed horses. Now, which horses am I going to ride? There's 2 horses here. Which one? Why buyers? You're right, it's buyers, but why? That's right. So they're insensitive to price. So if they're insensitive to price, I increase the taxes, they have all the burden. All right. Okay. Case 1. Supply is more elastic than demand. We'll just shift it a little bit, make it a little flatter than it was before. And with it being slightly flatter, it'll turn out that the burden is going to shift with regard to the incidence. This is the original equilibrium point. This is the tax that's being imposed. And now the price received by sellers is PS. The price paid by buyers is PB. And the buyer's share of the tax burden is going to be, by the way, keep this in mind all the time when you're doing these problems. Always measure everything relative to the initial equilibrium. If you don't do that, you're going to end up confusing yourself as you go through the analysis. Always keep in mind what the initial equilibrium is. Because look at here. If I didn't keep in mind what this initial equilibrium was, I could never determine what the buyer's share of the tax burden, right? And because supply is more elastic now, the seller's share of the tax burden is relatively smaller than it was before the supply was more elastic. Okay? Using the same language as you're reading for today's class, it's easier for sellers rather than buyers to leave the market, so buyers end up bearing most of the burden of the tax. Okay, let's look at a separate case where demand is more elastic. And now it's just going to turn out to be the opposite of what it just was. Did you have a question?
Yeah, just to clarify. So the more sensitive you